I'm Bay McFarlane, and I'm here with Father Sebastian Walshe, who has agreed to give an inspiring and encouraging and even a teaching message to the separated faithful who are participating in our retreat. And the people on the retreat use the book, The Gift of Self. And Father Walshe is the author of Understanding Marriage and Family. So, Father Walshe, can you just tell the viewers who don't know much about you a little about your background, and then
Sure.
say any encouraging words you can to separated faithful?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a Norbertine priest from St. Michael's Abbey in California. And educationally, maybe the most important places I've gone to school is I went to Thomas Aquinas College in California, a liberal arts college, which is very Catholic and an excellent educational institution. After that, I ended up going to Catholic University of America to study philosophy. And then I joined the Norbertines after that, and they sent me to the Angelicum in Rome, where I finished my degree in philosophy. So that's my educational background. I'm a convert to the Catholic faith. I became a Catholic when I was about 13, and I've loved it ever since. And I'm a little bit of a late vocation. I came to the Abbey when I was about 29, and was ordained a priest when I was 36. And it's been 16, almost 17 years of very beautiful vocation. So I'm very pleased to be with you, and especially those of you who are fighting to be faithful witnesses to the sacrament of marriage. The fact that you're struggling and fighting to be a witness is a sign that God's grace is working powerfully in your soul, and the mercy of God is especially apparent there. So I'm grateful to each and every one of you for coming to this retreat, and I hope that my words can strengthen you and be a source of grace for everyone here.
Thanks. So, what perspective would you like to offer?
Well, I'll give you, there's a couple of things that separated couples or people who are in very difficult marriages ask me. The first thing that I often get asked is something like this: Father, if my spouse just abandoned me, let's say you've got a wife whose husband just, committed adultery and ran off with another woman. It was nothing of her fault. She didn't do anything. She was always faithful to her vows. Why is it that I can no longer, I don't have the right to be happy and find another husband or another wife, if my spouse has abandoned me? And, at first it kind of sounds persuasive because you say, yeah, it's not your fault. But what I point out to them is that it's not about who's to blame or whose fault it is. It's about the vow that you took at the beginning of your marriage. Our marriage vows do not begin with the word if, right? You don't say, if you love me and honor me all the days of your life, then I will love you and honor you all the days of your life. You make an unconditional, unilateral vow before God and before the church and to your spouse. And at that moment, you say, it doesn't matter if you are unfaithful to me. It doesn't matter if you abandon me. It doesn't matter whether or not you love or honor me. My vow is not conditioned on that. I am making a unilateral and unconditional promise that needs God's grace and assistance for sure, but nevertheless, that's the promise I'm making. And that's why you have to be faithful, because you've made such a sacred promise before God and before the church and to your spouse, even if your spouse is unfaithful. Remember, marriage is a sacrament or a sign of the fidelity between Christ and his church. And even if the church were unfaithful, Christ would always be faithful. So in the same way, we have to be faithful to our spouse. Imagine if marriage vows began with the word if. Think of how marriages would be if every marriage vow began, well, if you love me and honor me all the days of your life, then I will love you and honor you all the days of your life. Marriage would not be anything to celebrate if that's how it was. So the truth of the matter is that marriage is such a beautiful, sacred, holy, wonderful thing, a source of such joy at the moment you take your vows, precisely because you're making such a great promise and it's such an act of tremendous, unselfish, completely other-oriented love. So, and because you made that act, you have to be faithful to it for all your days. So even if it's not your fault, even if your spouse has been unfaithful, you will be judged before God based on your fidelity. Your spouse will be judged before God based on his or her fidelity or lack thereof. But in any case, that's the reason why we stayed faithful to our vows, even if our spouse is unfaithful to theirs. So that's the first thing. Now, the second question is a little more difficult and thorny, I guess, and that's the question about abusive relationships. There are different ways in which there can be abuse in a relationship. There can be verbal abuse. That's fairly common. Even in good marriages, you'll see that every once in a while. And then there is physical abuse, right, and emotional abuse. And sometimes those can get very serious, right? And so people say to me, well, if I've got something, a case of abuse that's so serious, why should I have to remain in such an abusive relationship? Why can't I be free to be happy to find another spouse where I won't be in this abusive relationship? So the way I try to explain that is I give a little analogy or an example. I say, let's say that you had a toothache. And because you have this toothache, it's painful to eat. Is the solution to stop eating? And everyone says, well, no, of course not. You'd starve to death. Eating's good for you, and you have to eat. It's perfective of human nature to eat. So the problem isn't that you're eating. The problem is a bad tooth. Well, it's the same way with marriage. The problem, if you've got an abusive relationship, or one or both of the spouses are abusive towards the other, the problem is not that you're married. The problem is that there's abuse. So if marriage isn't the problem, divorce isn't the solution, right? Marriage is perfective of human nature, and it's even supernaturally perfective as a sacrament. And therefore, the problem is never that you're married. The problem is something else, right? So in a case like that, what you can and should do sometimes is you can separate from your spouse physically, especially if there's physical danger to you or to the children or something like that. But even in that separation, you're bound to be faithful to your spouse and not to remarry, not to marry someone else, and to pray for your spouse and do what you can, each of you on each side, to try and address the real problem, and that is the lack of virtue, which is the source of the abusive behavior. So that's really the real solution in a case like that. Now, I do want to say a little side thing here. With regard to verbal abuse, okay, it happens very often, like I said, that I get couples that are troubled and they talk about the verbal abuse. And sometimes a spouse who's more devout and more practicing their faith, they'll say to me, Father, is a Christian thing to do is basically be a doormat? If my spouse is abusing me, should I just sit there and let them say all these nasty things to me? Is that the Christian thing to do? And I say, actually, no, because you have an obligation in charity to fraternal correction. If you love your spouse, you're supposed to help them grow in charity. So let's say that your spouse says something abusive to you. The correct response is not to sit there like a doormat, but to say, don't speak that way to your spouse. Don't speak that way to your husband, or don't speak that way to your wife. It's not good for you. Don't make it an act of defense of yourself. Make it an act of love for your spouse. And that way, your spouse, you'll be surprised how often that takes the spouse off guard and makes them realize, yeah, this isn't good for me to treat my wife or my husband this way. So there are little things you can do if you're aware of, especially when things like this begin, if you can nip them in the bud, that can help prevent verbal abuse from avalanching in some ways as well. So those are a few things I just want to talk about. I don't know, Bea, if you have some follow-up questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, you talked about marriage is the perfection of human nature.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah. So when I talk about something being a perfection of human nature, I mean something that's the object of a natural inclination or desire. So I'll give you a few simple examples. We have a natural inclination to eat, to drink, to breathe, to reproduce. All of those are activities that are necessary for the being or the well-being of our human nature. If we don't eat or drink or breathe, then our human nature will just disappear shortly, right? And if we don't reproduce, our human nature will disappear eventually. In maybe 100 years or so, there won't be any human beings around if people don't do that activity right. And so clearly, it's natural for a man and a woman to come together and to have children. That's clearly the object of a natural inclination. Well, not only that, but it's also natural for someone to care for and raise their own child. Everyone knows that they have a natural inclination to love and care for their own child. Well, if you and another person have children together, therefore it's obvious that it's natural for the two of you to raise that child or those children together. So therefore, right away we see a lifelong union between a man and a woman is already something that's natural. It's necessary for the being and the well-being of human nature. And you can even see that monogamy is something natural because in our species, men and women are born in roughly equal numbers. Right? We're not like lions where it's like one male for 4 females or something like that, right? We're born in equal numbers. That's nature's sign of telling us we're supposed to pair up one on one and have a monogamous relationship. And then finally, even the fact that we make a public vow is natural. Why? For 2 reasons. First of all, it avoids or prevents adultery. If no one knows who's married to who because of a public vow, then you're at the supermarket and some cute girl comes up and they don't know you're married and they flirt with you and all sorts of things. That's why we wear wedding rings, in order to say, back off, I'm taken, right? So it's good to wear your wedding ring even if you're separated from your spouse. And secondly, I have a saying, in a world full of broken legs, it's important that there be casts.
What?
And what that means is this. In a world full of broken legs, it is important that there be casts.
Okay.
Because when a leg is broken, it doesn't have the strength to heal itself. You need external pressure holding the bones together to give them time to heal. And a public vow puts external pressure on a couple, holding that marriage together until it has more time to heal. It gives it some time to heal. So it's actually good for the stability of marriage that there be public vows. And since the stability of the husband and the wife's union is good for the upbringing of the children, therefore we see it's good for human nature in general, and therefore we see that marriage in its full sense is something natural and perfective of human nature. If there were no states, if there were no societies, if there were no countries with any laws, men and women would come together, have children together, and raise those children together. It's just what human nature demands in order for children to be happy, healthy, and to go on to the next generation. So that's what I mean by saying that marriage is natural and perfective of human nature.
Good. Thank you. Because one of the things that a separated faithful person is faced with is, I appreciate everything Father Walshe is saying. That's all beautiful. That all makes sense. But the other spouse is not interested in this at all anymore. The other spouse is saying, absolutely not, ain't happening.
Yes.
So what's the benefit of the one spouse hanging in there if all those other things seem to be broken and gone?
Yes. Well, again, like I said, what you've done now is you've been faithful not only to a vow before God, but you've also been faithful to something that's in itself perfective of your nature, right? If you go off and do something that in itself is harmful for human nature and also a violation of God's law, you might get some temporary satisfaction and emotional satisfaction in finding someone else who you enjoy being with. But in the long term, it'll eat at you. And it'll take away the deepest root of your peace, right? If it's a little bit like if I were to eat cotton candy and Twinkies and donuts all the time, well, sure, I'd enjoy it in the moment, but after a while, human nature just doesn't tolerate that kind of food. It needs healthy things like carrots and Brussels sprouts and all the things that aren't necessarily pleasant, but which are objectively healthy for human nature. And at the moral level, by analogy, there are also things that are morally, objectively healthy for human nature, and also that are supernaturally healthy, as we see in the commandments of God, if you're a believer. And for both those reasons, you'll find greater peace and a deeper happiness and joy, knowing I've done the right thing. I've done what in and of itself is what a person ought to do in my circumstances. And therefore, it brings a longer lasting, deeper peace of soul and ultimately truer happiness.
This is a question I just thought of. It's been a while since I read your book, and I'm remembering a lot of this deals with the confused understanding of marriage regarding the homosexual issue.
Yeah.
But do you touch on the confused idea of marriage with no-fault divorce? Because, maybe 100 years ago, if a husband abandoned his wife and she had children, I've had one divorce lawyer tell me, those kind of husbands used to be put in jail. It's like it was not okay. And now when the husband wants to abandon his wife, he just goes to the state and says, irreconcilable
Yes.
differences or irretrievable breakdown, or we've been separated
Yes.
for 3 months, whatever their state happens to say, at which
Yes.
point the divorce shall be granted, and the children and those other spouse will be forced to live this divorce court order for the rest of the time.
Yes. Well, I give that as an example of one of the most serious injustices in our society, that the state in our society always sides with the person who wants the marriage less, right? That is the state's official position. Now, originally, you and I are both old enough to remember how they got no-fault divorce in. They kept on putting it under the sheepskin. It was a wolf in sheep's clothing of basically, oh, well, what if you have this poor woman who's being beaten by her husband, and the poor thing has no way out, and therefore it's really to these defenseless people who need a way out of their marriage. Therefore, we need to have some no-fault divorce. But really what no-fault divorce was pushed by was adulterous people who wanted out of their marriage for simply reasons of lust or something else or financial reasons. And therefore, they were the ones who were really pushing this grave injustice. Because as you say, when, for example, a man or a woman is suddenly abandoned by their spouse for no good reason, they've been a faithful, good husband or wife, and now they and their children are gravely harmed simply because of the whim of the other spouse. That might be just because they want to have commit adultery. They'll find more money elsewhere or whatever else. You see the grave injustice done to people, and yet in our society, that's a grave injustice that is not rectified. So I agree that is one of the grave injustices we have in our society today. There are many others in our society, but that's one of the most serious injustices we have in our society, and it reflects a complete misunderstanding on the part of the state about the true nature of marriage. Because the state thinks that marriage is created by the state, and that's just a legal contract that the state can dissolve at will. But that's not true. The state only has the duty and the right to recognize marriage as something natural, rather than something artificial created by and at the whim of the will of the state. So that's a fundamental mistake about the nature of marriage that's entered public policy. And anyway, we need a saner understanding of marriage as something natural.
Well, what I also thought of as you were talking about the state thinking it takes over marriage, the other spouses, at least the ones who are abandoners, they say things like, I don't love you anymore, our marriage is over.
Yeah.
And from your perspective, knowing what really is marriage, what's the essence of marriage, how does a faithful spouse rebut that? Maybe once you rebut it to the other spouse, but even in one's own mind. This is hard to answer.
Yes.
You're saying our marriage is over. I don't want to be married to you anymore.
Yes.
Divorce lawyers are saying, why do you want to be married to someone that doesn't want to be married to you? Your marriage is over. What really is the essence of marriage? That's nonsense, and how does one explain that away?
Yes. Well, that's a large question, but allow me to at least give a brief answer to that. Modern people today think the essence of marriage is that it's a kind of a contract between two people, and the whole purpose is that we're fulfilling each other emotionally or romantically. That's the modern view of marriage, which is why, for example, the state grants the name marriage to two men or two women, because obviously romantic feelings can happen between anyone. And for that matter, there's no reason why it has to be one man and one woman, or it could be 3 men and 4 women for that matter. There's no limits on the possibilities of romantic feelings. But in fact, marriage is something which in its essence is ordered to the generation, the education of children. That's why it's rooted in human nature, as I argued before. So the essence, the definition of marriage as something natural would be a lifelong communion between a man and a woman, established by their free consent, which is for the sake of the generation, the education of children. And if it's a sacramental marriage, it's also a sign of the union of the divine and the human, as St. Paul says in his epistle to the Ephesians. So marriage is in and of itself ordained to be a vehicle for the bringing of new life into the world and the cherishing of that life, and also as a sign, a sacramental sign of the union of Christ and his church. Now, a lot of people say, but what about love? I say, well, sure, love belongs to a good marriage, right? But you don't define something by what makes it good, but what makes it exist, right? I don't define a man by virtue. He doesn't cease to be if he ceases to be virtuous. And a marriage doesn't cease to be.
Can you say that again? Because that was a really good, quick point. We define...
A man doesn't cease to be if he ceases to be virtuous, right?
Even before that, you said we don't define something by what
makes it good. So we don't define something by what makes it good, but by what makes it exist, or what makes it be, right?
Yeah, thanks.
So we don't define a man, for example, by virtue, right? A vicious man still exists. Yeah. So in the same way, we don't define a marriage by love. It's true that you need love for a good marriage, but that doesn't mean that you cease being in a marriage if you cease loving, right? And even if the motive that most people have for coming into marriage, that doesn't mean that's the intrinsic purpose of marriage, right? A medical student might have as his motive for becoming a doctor to make a lot of money, but the intrinsic purpose of medicine is to heal, right? Not business school. You're not going to business school. You're going to medical school. And it's the same way with marriage. Your motive might be love, but the intrinsic purpose of marriage is to bring new life into the world and to foster that life and to educate those children, and also to be a sacrament of the union of Christ and his church. And even if no children come, I always point out, it's also good for a tree to blossom even if it doesn't bear fruit, right? In other words, an intermediate perfection, just being married is perfective of human nature, even if you don't have children, right? It's good for a man to have the virtue of generosity, even if there's no poor people to help. Right? So being married is still perfective of your nature, even if you're infertile and no children happen to come. You've still done something good that's perfective of your nature, that fulfills the intrinsic principles within human nature, and because it's been elevated to a sacrament for believers, it even perfects you at a supernatural level as well. So there are many, many good reasons for staying faithful to your marriage, even if you're in grave difficulties. And God will reward you for this. So I promise you, God will reward you to be faithful to your marriage.
I'm going to try to put into the words of a separated faithful perspective what I picked up from you just saying. So when the other spouse says, I don't want to be married to you anymore.
Yes.
It's like, well, that's like saying you don't want to be a human being anymore. It's not an option. We are married. You can't not be married because you are.
Yes.
Or when they say, I don't love you anymore, it's like, well, you're not a human being just because you're breaking all the commandments. It's that much of what it is. It's already there. So whether or not it's the good feeling doesn't make it the marriage or not the marriage.
Yeah, you're in an objective relationship regardless. So to give another example, once you become a parent, you can never cease being a parent.
That's a good one.
You can get into something, you can cause something to come to be. That doesn't mean you can cause it to cease to be, right? So you can become a parent, but you can't just suddenly say, I'm no longer a parent and walk away from your relationship with your children. The same way you can become a spouse, you can't just walk away from that relationship. You're objectively a spouse no matter what from that point on, just as you're objectively a parent from that moment on, right, once you've had a child. So those kinds of fundamental human relationships are permanent. They're permanent, and so it's important to recognize that and to say, I'm not going to be a better person, better man or woman if I try to walk away from these things and deny the truth about me.
You know, I'm a believer that society is going to go through pendulums, and things are going to get really crazy, but then they'll swing back. Maybe they'll crazy the other direction. This one's just, do you have any thoughts on how separated faithful could be an instrument for having this pendulum come back to normalcy about marriage?
Yeah, well, one thing that is always attractive at all times and all places is heroic virtue. I point out, you know, at the time that the Roman Empire was converted by the Christians to Christianity, only 1 in 7 members of the Roman Empire professed themselves as Christian. They were by far a minority amongst all the others. The others were all pagans. And yet because they had such heroic faith. They were all willing to die for their faith. That 1/7, that tiny minority, has such powerful faith and such a great witness that all the rest, the other 6/7 of the Roman Empire, couldn't resist it. Eventually, they all realized that, okay, they're not going to give. We have to give. We have to change. We have to convert. So that witness of heroic virtue is always attractive. And remember, Jesus came into a world that was completely enveloped in sin. One man. And then he ordained 12 priests, 12 apostles, and they somehow changed the entire world. So don't think that because your number is small that you can't have a great effect. Remember what Jesus says, that the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. Small in size, but great in power. And God will use your heroic virtue, your heroic witness to love in order to help convert the whole world, not just your family, but the whole world.
I think that's a good stopping point. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I just want to thank you for the opportunity here to address all of you and to assure you that you're all in my prayers.
Thank you, Father Walshe.
Please pray for me.